Welcome back to Normal Island. I'm Sarah Dallal and I'm joined with none other but Cog. Good to have you. How are you?
Hey, yeah, I'm not doing too badly. I just watched a whole torrent unfold with tech issues behind the scenes. It was great. I wish I could share it with all of you, but unfortunately, it was it was me watching Callum and Sarah try and work out the tech issues. It was
It
a
was a
lot of
sight.
fun on my end, not so much fun on their end.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it was a sight. But I think this is where I'm going to shamelessly plug us. If you want to see us succeed and get us our own studio, then please check out turnleftmedia.co.uk/support. And so check out Patreon. A donation goes a long way, but honestly, your presence is so much more priceless. So I'll just put that there too. Right. Anyways, coming off on tonight's show, we've got 13 million people displaced, mass rape, famine, Sudan's silent genocide. We've also got a study that finds that Southport riots were in fact racist. And Starmer gives chilling pro war speech where he discusses that Britain's military has just got 10 times more lethal. As always, though, remember to like the stream. And if you're not a subscriber, I hate saying this part, but yeah, please do subscribe and tell a friend of a friend. We'll be getting to your comments later, so be busy in the chat. But on to our first story. When the civil war began in Sudan, Shiraz Yusuf couldn't hear the explosions, the gunfire, or the screams. She felt them tremble through the walls. She navigated chaos without sounds, no sirens, no warnings, just vibrations and flashing lights. She tells CNN, I'm afraid all the time, and I don't know when it's going to happen again. This is one of the most underreported stories, yet the numbers in this conflict are staggering. As of May 2025, 13 million people have been displaced due to the conflict in Sudan, marking it as one of the world's worst displacement crises. 24.6 million people in Sudan are facing acute hunger, with famine confirmed in 10 areas. Over 30 million people, nearly two-thirds of Sudan's population, are in need of humanitarian assistance and protection services. In Darfur, this war has turned genocidal. Militias loyal to the RSF, Rapid Support Forces, are using rape as a weapon of war. In just one region, Doctors Without Borders have stated that they've treated 659 survivors of sexual violence between January 2024 and March 2025. One woman described being attacked whilst gathering firewood. Others were taken from their homes or refugee camps. In one village, all the men and boys were executed, whilst the women were raped en masse. And yet, despite these staggering and horrific statistics, the world barely looks up from its screen. The world barely speaks on it. Why? And that's where I want to bring Cog in. Cog, why do you think this conflict that's happening, on this scale with genocide, mass displacement, rape, sexual violence, all these like executions, gets so little sustained media attention in the West? And what does the silence around Sudan actually reveal about the global hierarchy of whose suffering is considered newsworthy?
yeah. I well, first of all, I do think that it's kind of the scale of it is something that were it happening almost anywhere outside of Africa, it would gain more attention than it currently does. And part of this is the fact that the way that we view Africa in the West, and the way that we view African nations in the West, is lumping them all into a single a single group, Africa. And Africa is just where conflicts happen. There's lots of corruption, and it's kind of othered from the nature of what drives it. I was looking for the term. I found it.
Mm.
Dana Ramey Berry in her book A Black Woman's History of the United States, which might not seem related to this, but I'm going to pull it back, talks about the idea of fictive kinship as something which is um, heavily heavily influences the history of slavery in the USA, and the that history of slavery unified lots and lots of different people into one group, the Black American, and lots of different communities who spoke lots of different languages into one. And this is, this is like a metaphor for what we do in terms of Orientalism and our
Mm.
view of Africa. There are more parallels that I can kind of go into, but I want to leave that for later questions. Being somebody who works for Turn Left, I get to see the questions in advance, unlike
Me
a lot of
too.
the people who come on and get. Um, but yeah, white supremacy plays a big role in this, of course. And the fact of Africa being orientalized and seen as other is also part of protecting our own identity and our own story of colonialism in history. It's like colonialism is resigned to the past. It's not something that happens nowadays, and so countries in Africa must be to blame for their own conflict. And Sudan is no exception to this. I say countries in Africa because while I was sort of like making notes for this, I was also thinking of the Congo actually.
Mm.
Um, and another parallel between the Congo is and with the RSF as well is the internally displaced persons and the mass sexual violence. And the problem is for a lot of human rights organizations is they are trying to report on this stuff, but because of the um, like rampant levels of misogyny and because of the traditions of not speaking out and the shame culture, purity culture associated with being a victim of sexual violence in Sudan,
Mm.
so often it's difficult for people to report and to get justice for victims. And when this is happening in the kind of fractured, stochastic way that it is in Sudan, um, it is really difficult to actually get justice for those victims, and that leads to a situation where there's a very clear, very clear reporting when it comes to say that the sexual violence on October 7th, right? You want to talk about the way that sexual violence has been reported in the media and done in a way that actually humanizes the victims. That would be like an example, right?
Mm.
It did, it humanized the victims and said this, this is unacceptable. It's unacceptable to use sexual violence as a method of war. But the same thing happens in Africa, and it's almost silent.
Yeah.
Um, we were chatting with Aaron Bastani at the weekend because we were at Media Democracy Festival, and I do think that Aaron was correct when he said, just an offhand comment, by the way, he said that in his opinion as a journalist, Sudan is probably one of the most underreported conflicts in the world, and underreported mass atrocities. I'm not sure if we
Mm.
can class it as a genocide exactly, but
I
I
think
feel like I should turn around and ask Sarah that because,
yeah, I mean,
yeah,
this is the thing because I know that genocides obviously have some sort of definition, right? That people are so like, well, no, it can't be a genocide because it has to fulfill all of these these tick boxes. But obviously, this story hits very very close to home. I'm Sudanese. My family is entirely from Sudan, so this catastrophe is not an isolated internal tragedy. This is something that impacts. And this is something even that we can see. There's international complicity. There's imperialism that comes under this, and I think the reason why I get so passionate about it isn't just because I'm Sudanese, but because I've had to see firsthand my family have to be refugees in Uganda, to move through countries and borders, not by means of plane but by means of foot. So the struggle is absolutely very real, and you're so right in saying that there is a white supremacist element to this. That imperialism, sorry's legacy in this is undeniable, there is an ongoing complicity when we think about that. It's underreported because I think it has imperialistic undertones to it. We have seen Western and regional powers really take a grip or take advantage of Sudan. Like their fingerprints are all over Sudan's pain, and it has been for years. For decades, I think Sudan has been used as a pawn in geopolitical terms. And that's a frightening prospect. And I think it kind of like leads on quite nicely to my next question for you, which is we know that the silence here is obviously incredibly neglectful, but again, it's that imperial complicity that these countries in the global north, these Western superpowers, do are complicit in all of this. Sudan's gold is mined in blood-soaked fields, is shipped to Dubai, financing the RSF, and then when Sudanese forces are raided. warlord Hemedti's home, they found gold stamped for export to the UAE. So the rapid support for my speech today is terrible. The rapid support forces drives these armored vehicles and these drones supplied by the Emirates, built with French components, and despite a UN arms embargo, it's still happening. So I guess my question to you is, we need to talk about the role of foreign governments in all of this, like the UAE, France, and Britain, in actively fueling this conflict through arms sales and gold laundering. How does modern imperialism come into this, like through extractive trade and strategic neglect? How does it still play a role in all of this?
Yeah, my understanding is from what I've read that uh, gold extraction, I mean, is at the heart of all of this, and gold laundering from the to the UAE, excuse me, is fueling both sides of the conflict. That is my understanding. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think both the RSF and the SAF
Yes.
both get like a great deal of their military expenditure from uh, I say illegal, semi-illegal,
Mm,
at least illegal in de jure terms. I think in de facto terms, it's sort of like broadly ignored by the the government and the I can't remember the term for the RSF government. It's the government of something in unity,
mm,
government of peace and unity. That's the term I was looking for.
yeah.
So approximately 85% of the gold that's mined in Sudan is mined by small scale artisan miners, what's called artisan miners. Basically, it's mined in little pockets. It's not mined in one big strip. So the incentive structures that we're talking about here matter a lot. It is something that is systemic. It's not something where you can point to a government. You look at Israel Palestine. You can point to Benjamin Netanyahu and go, okay, so he's not all of the center of power, but there is like an obvious actor that is benefiting from this, and the people around him are benefiting from this. It's much more complex when it comes to Sudan and gold, because 85% of it is mined in these little pockets. And the incentive structures that they face mean that they're sort of forced into those conditions. Now, it's important to note the gold is processed using cyanide, among other things, and is extremely the processing it goes through is extremely hazardous to the health of the people there. I was reading a story about a Sudanese girl who came out reasonably healthy, but because of the conditions that she's living in and because of the treatment of this gold that goes on in her village, she couldn't walk by the time she was 4. Like like cyanide poisoning starts to collapse your body's ability to function and work.
Mm,
It's like absolutely horrific. Um, but there's a parallel here in terms of incentive structure with the colonial violence again used in the slave trade in West Africa in the 1700s. It's new colonialism, but it's old
yeah.
colonialism at the same time, because the way that the slave trade in West Africa worked was that, and by the way, I'm talking about the Westerners coming and enslaving people. The way that it would work is that you had a choice essentially as a West African in the what 15th to 18th century. You could and you in your community could either trade with the Europeans, and what the Europeans wanted was slave labor. Um, you could trade. You could either trade with the Europeans and provide them slave labor, which meant going to war with your neighbors, and in return, the Europeans would give you weapons. They'd give you guns, so that you would be able to, uh, you know, keep your community safe by destroying another community, or you were enslaved yourself and you were sent off in slave ships. And that was the way that you always hear it said by people who just don't take the stuff seriously. They say, "Oh, but black people were enslaving black people in Africa, at the time," and it's like,
Yeah.
no, it's such an awful misrepresentation of what went on. But the point is this colonialism is the same. It functions the same. The people who are
Mm,
actually responsible for it never have to take accountability, but they create an incentive structure where you are either subject to violence because you've chosen a side, or you are complicit in that violence. right?
Yeah.
You have to you have to pick a side, and both sides of the civil war are not only funded through UAE gold, but it's important to say that Russia's African Corps,
Yes.
previously known as the Wagner Group, you might remember Prigozhin, their former leader, attempting a military coup on Vladimir Putin inside Russia. That they're involved in all this as well. So this has massive implications and affects the stability of the rest of the world. But the incentive structure means that nobody, not the Russians, not the Chinese, not the British, not the UAE, no one is ever held accountable for it,
Mm.
because it's all structural in its nature, right? I mean, just thinking like regionally, you've got Egypt, which is sandwiched between Sudan and Palestine, and the Egyptians are extremely concerned because they've got like conflict either side of them, and the stability of Egypt, of course, being one of the richer African nations, affects the stability of large parts of the rest of the world. Um, it is concerning, and it will eventually affect us,
Oh,
even in
absolutely.
smaller ways. But yeah, sorry, I've sort of waffled for ages, but
No, no, no. It's always valuable waffle. The thing, and I think Sudan, the story of Sudan, deserves a segment in and of itself, where it isn't just limited to a 15-20 minute um, soundbite. Because I think what we're seeing at the moment is that the media silence upon us is concerning. And I think it's not even just about, and I think you've pointed to this quite nicely, it's not even just about neglect. There is a racist and imperialist apathy attached to this as well. And it is
mm,
entrenched in global politics that if we see a shift happening in Sudan in the way that in the way that it is, it will naturally seep out into neighboring countries, into neighboring nations, and then eventually with us. But that shouldn't be the reason why we decide to step in. I think that we need to start interrogating the fact that wars that happen in Africa, conflicts that happen in Africa, genocides that happen there are always treated as some sort of background noise and not as the fundamental atrocious act it is. And the message is implicit, but it's incredibly clear that in the eyes of our world order, Sudanese lives aren't deemed important enough for it to be in the media. So how else can we explain that disparity? How else can we say that women and girls are being raped in the way that they are? How else can we explain that millions of people have been displaced? Like people, there should be outrage when it comes to this. But I'm conscious of time, and I will probably get on to our next story unless you want to say anything else, Cole.
no, I
No.
think I'll probably leave that one there. I think that was a fairly
Yeah.
good summary at the end from you. That's great.
Thank you. Right. So on to our next story. Three girls, Elsie, Bibi, and Alice, very, very famous names, but not for the best reasons, unfortunately, were murdered at a dance class last summer. A tragedy they were all very much aware of, but made worse by a lie. Far right accounts online weaponized this traumatic incident as a means to assert their political agenda and spread a rumor that the attacker was both a Muslim and an asylum seeker. And we all know what happened. Within hours, there were mobs of white people rioting in Southport, and then in Manchester, and then in Blackpool, and then in other cities as well. It wasn't a protest, as some people like to argue. It was most certainly racial violence. And according to a new study reported by The Guardian, the Southport riots mirror the race riots of 1958 more than the 2011 uprisings after Mark Duggan. But why? Because in 2011, poor and racialized communities rose up against the state. In Southport, it was the white majority targeting minorities. Here's what lead author John Jury, professor of social psychology at the University of Sussex, said. He says, some people call these protests far right protests, but were they protests? Well, they didn't take the usual form of protest. I mean, maybe you might call them some kind of direct action. Our evidence suggests that participants in the three riots comprised a racial majority, i.e., white people seeking to attack minoritized ethnic groups. As such, these riots were unlike the waves of urban riots in the UK in the 1980s and 2011, which involved an ethnic minority against authority. Arguably, in the summer riots of 2024, had more in common with the race riots in Notting Hill and Nottingham in 1958 and those in Liverpool and Cardiff in 1919. The violence in the summer of 1958 began in the St Anne's area of Nottingham and was followed by similar disorder in Notting Hill, fueled by tensions over increased migration from the Caribbean. Violent attacks were carried out by groups of white men, with them using weapons against black people. Black homes were also targeted in arson attacks. The paper then says events largely comprised attacks rather than protests, pointing to the length of the collective actions, the relative absence of protest, event paraphernalia, and the unprovoked nature of the violence, which at least half of those in each anti immigrant participants engaged in. Those attending were not just far right activists or individuals affiliated with football risk groups, but also non affiliated individuals who were anti immigration, people who were anti police, and also bystanders who were there to see or record exciting events or who joined in spontaneously. None of this fully surprises me, to be honest, Cog. I mean, given all this research that's just come out from this study, are you surprised with their findings?
It is a bit kind of I'm trying to think of a better term than bear shits in woods. Like that is the way it feels to me. It feels a bit like yeah, I could have told you all this like months ago.
Mm,
And I feel like the left broadly has been fairly like on this. But it's worth saying that always for emphasis that right wing violence is so often this stochastic thing that we see, and it punches down. It's initiated not from the very top, but the radicalization happens at the very top. The extremism, the extreme language comes from the very top, and then the decision to actually take action and to commit violence so often comes from much lower down the sort of pyramid of power, if you like. Um, yeah, it's so, and of course the way that right wing violence happens is that they punch down because right wing ideology at its core, it's a kinetic movement without an analysis of power.
mm,
And that is why right wing violence always punches down because right wingers are always thinking movement. They're always thinking, I want somebody who tells it like it is, right?
yeah.
And like I get that sort of like instinct, that sort of like I want somebody who's straight talking with me. No one likes being lied to, right? No one listens
Mm,
to say Keir Starmer, one of the greatest liars of our current political generation. No one's keen on Keir Starmer. No one likes
yeah.
being lied to, but that's a very different thing to a complete disregard for any analysis. Saying it like it is not a real representation of the actual way the world is. Sometimes I feel like the term saying it like it is and the way that these things are often thought about is often a byword for playing to my sympathies and just thinking the world is actually a lot simpler and nastier than it is. And that sort of rhetoric is what leads to this kind of violence. It's not a surprise at all because our media has been filled with this kind of rhetoric for the past few
Mm.
years.
I think that's a really good point, actually, because they've definitely contributed to it, right? Like this is it's an eruption of structured racism and misplaced anger, essentially. I don't think it's some spontaneous community that's been like, oh, we're really angry about these policies and we really do care about protecting children. Like, they didn't care about any of those things. They found it to be an opportunity to assert a really really harmful agenda against people that didn't look like them. And the research kind of confirms that, but I don't think we needed that research to really believe that. But maybe I don't think that many of the people who were at these riots are Guardian readers or probably do read the paper as much as we do. But to think that this, I think that the one thing that did surprise me is that this thing wasn't just um, far righters or people who are somewhat affiliated with politics. It's actually just like bystanders who saw this thing going on and were like, yeah, fuck it. Let me get my camera out. Let me join in. All the police are there, can't stand the system. So let me throw some bottles at them too and harm them in the process. So they
Mm,
were literally drawn by anti immigrant sentiment or simply just the thrill of destruction. And that to me is quite a scary, scary thing. Racist violence doesn't exist on the fringes of society. I think it spills from the middle. I think that's what happens, and I think we don't often hear it described in those terms because, like you said, we are seeing. And I used to read so many articles that would call groups of people thugs, but it was always pointed towards racialized communities. So. my next question to you is like, what would true racial justice look like when history literally shows that it keeps repeating, it keeps happening like this? Why is it that marginalized communities, because we saw it after Mark Duggan was killed by police, that there were lots of riots that happened as a result of that. Why is it we still find racialized, minoritized communities under attack by majority populations decades after the so-called empire and the progress of civil rights?
And I promise I will answer that question, but just something that occurred to me when you were saying that, and the fact that
Yeah.
this was reported in the Guardian. Yes, they probably won't read the Guardian, but it does point to an underlying problem as well, which is people reading the Guardian will read this and they will go, well, obviously, people who you can't essentialize people's where people came from,
Mm,
and say, oh well, that the reason that Axel Rudakabana committed the crimes that he did is because him or his parents were from Rwanda. He's an immigrant. He's not an immigrant, but he was actually born in Wales. But his parents were immigrated to this country, so
mm,
to them, he's an immigrant.
yeah.
Right, the essentialization of people from elsewhere as bad, and the Guardian reader sits there, they read this information, and they go, obviously that's so stupid. I can't believe that you would assume that somebody is violent, and that violence is essential to their character and essential to their presence in Britain, and in this space, um, and that they're inherently a threat. It's just a total misrepresentation of immigration communities. But what's baffling to me is that same Guardian reader can turn the page and read the next article, and read a Guardian article about trans women in bathrooms and
Yeah.
go, well, obviously these people are a danger to women in bathrooms because I've got an essentialist idea
Yeah.
about what it means to have a man in a woman's bathroom, and must essentially be a threat. A trans woman must essentially be a threat. By the way, when I say a man in a woman's bathroom, I'm not. That's not language I would use. I'm saying how they would speak. And so I say, oh, this is inherently a threat to women or whatever. It's just the problem is the problem of essentialization, and the problem of ignoring the actual statistics on these things, which show that immigrants and trans people are the least likely to actually commit violence. It's actually people who were born here, and people whose families were born here, who
Mm.
commit the most violence, and it's cis men who commit the most violence overall. But that's a side point. I actually dodged your question.
No, it's so
Um,
fine. But
Sorry.
no, no, but I just want to add on to that as well, because I have these conversations all the time, particularly with my family and stuff. And the media is a massive contributor to this sort of stuff. Like, I do
Mm,
think they contribute to this, but you're absolutely right in the sense that people are going to look at the Guardian and be like, oh, these coffee drinking people from reusable cups and tree hugging individuals that want to read left wing media. Like, they think Guardian readership is full of commies. I think they're just very, very like surface level individuals. But the media definitely amplifies all of these stories to create more media coverage that attracts more audiences. But
mm,
I think a lot of that is driven by this far right rhetoric. And I remember back when I was at university, I kept seeing language like, particularly from outlets that were not that great, but they would say that it was, when talking about migration, a swarm of individuals, and like you said, like man in dress and blah blah blah, male police officer that wants to be a woman. Like, they would say really, really dehumanizing language. And to someone who is quite surface level, they'll be like, oh yeah, like absolutely, like this is the woke agenda. And we actually saw it when Callum went and did his Vox Pops, with the national British strike thing, and people were saying some pretty heinous things. Not heinous things, just misplaced things, I would say. Yeah. Sorry, Callum just said something in my ear, and I absolutely agreed. Although they said some pretty uneducated things, but that's not. I don't know. It's difficult because I always want to be as gentle as possible with people like that, but it is difficult when you have them driving a really, really harmful rhetoric to try and convince people that people are in harm's way.
which leads us actually nicely back to the
The
question that I
question.
didn't know if you I don't know if you did that deliberately, but that was brilliant because your question was, how what does racial justice look like in an environment like this?
Yeah,
And I was going to say that it does have to be. I understand you want to be nice to these people. I really do, and that is because you are a lovely person. However, a lot of this
I
does
agree.
have to be stamped out through quite forceful
It does.
rhetoric. That does mean, I'm sorry, it does mean being mean to people, and it does mean being willing to break some eggs.
But who holds them accountable? I personally,
Mhm.
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, would feel
Yeah.
very uncomfortable being in a space. I was supposed to be there with Callum, couldn't, like, it was too difficult. It was quite scary. Like,
Mm,
to think that people hold these anti-immigrant, anti-migrant sentiments, and they look at a black person, they say, "You are not British." How many times have we been on TikTok and people have said, "You're not British"? Like, you don't have a say in British
mm.
policy or British issues. You're not a British person, despite being born and raised in this country. Who holds those people accountable in a way that is safe?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think it does fall a lot of the time to organisations like Turn Left. You can
Mm,
go to turnleft.co.uk/support if you like. But no. I joke, but I genuinely do think a lot of this is going to fall on independent media organizations to actually do the work which the media are not willing to do, and some of that is because the media are regulated. They cannot be as mean as we can just pull up a video of Tommy Robinson, play it, deconstruct what he's saying, but also point out that he's like a cowardly little wimp, right? We can point out that
yeah.
he's a multiply convicted fraudster. He's a weirdo. Like we can point these things out, and of course, if someone said that on the BBC, it'd be like, oh, don't attack him personally. No, attack him personally. Do it, because I'm sorry, these people. It's not like you're playing a game here where if you don't resort to personal attacks, the right wing won't resort to personal attacks. They will, 100% they will. And I do think if you think about Reconstruction in the USA, or you think about denazification efforts in Germany, a lot of it is kind of authoritarian sounding, but it's the paradox of tolerance, right? From Karl Popper, the idea that if you tolerate intolerance, you are setting up a society that is just intolerant. Because if you tolerate intolerance, eventually the intolerant will get power, and when they do, there's no tolerance in that society, and
Mm,
that's sort of what is happening. The intolerant are gaining power and do need to be like it does need to be stamped out. On the sort of nicer side, or the sort of more gentle side, um, a lot of this has to do with education on empire, education on uh, the effects of empire, education
yeah,
on the Windrush generation, and you know, just the Windrush generation as an example. It's so much more complex than that. Um, but yeah, the left needs to get more comfortable
I
fighting back
agree.
against these people and being seen as confrontational, because we have, we have facts, we have history, we have evidence on our side, and yeah, we just need to be fighting
Yeah.
back a lot harder.
Agreed. I agree. And this is the fundamental, right? Britain has to remember its own legacy of racial violence, and not just the celebratory parts that are associated with our history, but the 1958 Notting Hill riots, absolutely talk about it. The 1919 riots, talk about it. And now Southport 2024. Like, there have been plenty of moments in British history and Britain's story that should not be erased or sanitized for the purposes of appeasing Britain's, or even trying to retain this caricature of what Britain is supposedly all about. I think our natural consciousness has to confront these uncomfortable truths, because when we really cut to the core, Britain's story is not just one of multicultural tolerance or a distant colonial sin. It's definitely something that is homegrown white riots and the resistance to them. And I think that that's something that needs to be spoken about. And I think it's time we face that. If we don't, I think what we do face is this really, really pathetic, sympathetic framing around British history, which is both the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I think that we need to reject convenient narratives. But you said it so well, Cog. I'm very grateful. Right. I think we should have a support video if you guys could please check it out.
5 years, there has been a massive transfer of wealth from the working and middle classes to the top 1%. Billions of pounds have been taken from the workers and handed to the economic elites. In 2008, the world came to a standstill. The market had failed. Capitalism was in crisis. Yet 16 years on, nothing has changed. The bankers weren't jailed, the banks were bailed out, ordinary people lost everything. It's 2025 and we are now reckoning with a Labour Party that seeks to implement a Tory agenda. We face rising right-wing forces, more division, more misinformation. Yet no one in the mainstream media wants to talk about the real issue, the economic elites who have increased their wealth while the rest of us have become poorer. This isn't just a crisis of inequality, it's a crisis of democracy. The rich aren't just getting richer, they're owning everything. We are facing a global oligarchy and nothing is being done. Why? Because of our media. The same oligarchs who hoard wealth also control our press and now our social networks. This is why independent media isn't just important, it's necessary. It's why we're calling on your support. Turn Left is an organisation run by 5 volunteers working around our full-time jobs. Your contributions have already made a huge difference, whether by covering rallies, producing vox pops and interviews, or upgrading our equipment. That's all possible because of you. But we can do so much more. We can be far more ambitious. So head over to turnleftmedia.co.uk/support, become a monthly supporter, or give a one-off donation. If you want to fight back against the billionaire class, then help us build a media for people, a media for planet, a media for socialism. Smash the oligarchs. Join Turn Left.
Smash the oligarchs, indeed. Okay, heavy emphasis on new equipment, please and thank you. It has been quite the struggle today, but I think also heavy emphasis on the fact that 5 volunteers, we all work around our full-time jobs, but we love doing what we do and we love being able to be around you guys, and being supported by you guys is one of the biggest, most wonderful things about Turn Left. So yeah, go check out turnleftmedia.co.uk/support. But on to our final story. Starmer, I think he's been on the news quite considerably today, but Keir Starmer's government has unveiled a sweeping strategic defence review. Defence Secretary John Healey told Parliament that Britain's army must become battle ready and 10 times more lethal. Quotation marks. Their plan: billions of new factories, AI-guided missiles, long-range drones, and a nuclear fleet expansion, all in the name of deterrence. But whilst they ramp up the war, public services are crumbling. The NHS waiting list is at 7.4 million. Councils are collapsing. Bins aren't being collected, and yet they found £6 billion for weapons. Worse, they're paying for it by slashing foreign aid to just 0.3% of national income, the lowest in a generation. Aid workers say it will risk lives in places like Sudan and Gaza. And this militarization isn't neutral. Britain remains one of the world's top arms exporters. In just one quarter, Starmer's government approved 10.9 million in arms sales to Israel. As bombs fell on Gaza, £1.65 billion went to Saudi, which is still bombing Yemen. The government talks about peace, but it's feeding war and profiting. This from a prime minister who once stood as a human rights lawyer. Now he promises a military that's more lethal than ever. Is this actually about safety, or is this some sort of imperial nostalgia Britain is longing for, chasing relevance by projecting power abroad whilst people suffer at home? I've talked at you enough. I want to interrogate Starmer a little bit more. Of Cog, what does this actually mean? All of this battle readiness, let's be 10 times more lethal. What does this really mean in 2025 and the 21st century? And who are we actually preparing to fight?
I think it means Keir Starmer's got really desperate. I think that's part of the story here. I was just looking at it, and I was trying to look at how much Keir Starmer saved from the changes to pension winter fuel payments, and of course that burnt a lot of his political capital, and it was like 1.2 billion. Officially, the numbers are 1.2 billion. I think it's maybe as high as 4 billion projected to be saved. But the spending announced in this what's the term, the military review, um, the strategic defense review. Sorry, was the term I was trying to remember. That is 6 billion. 6 billion outstrips that easily. If he simply hadn't announced this, then you know, he could have saved himself a complete political headache by not making the changes to the winter fuel payment. In fact, he could have doubled the winter fuel payment with this money. But I'm not saying that's what he necessarily should have done. But I'm just saying that the priority is always interesting. As the late great Tony Benn said, if you can find money to bomb people, you can find money to help people. There's also the fact that the Starmer saying the 10 times more lethal military line is very reminiscent, isn't it? It's very reminiscent of Kamala Harris saying that America's military should be the most lethal military in the world, and if it wasn't, she would make it the most lethal military in the world again. It's playing into this nationalist base that for both Starmer and Harris isn't there. It doesn't exist. It's a fantasy. The people who are like that hard in terms of nationalism, they're either voting Conservative, very few of those left, or they're voting for reform. It's again part of this wider picture of Starmer trying to play into his trying to play to the right wing, and the right wing are just not having any of it. And for some reason, Morgan McSweeney and Keir Starmer just seem unable to adapt their strategy in any way, which is funny because adaptation is a really important thing to have if you're talking about strategic defense. And this strategic defense review, like recommends, like explicitly that, well, it says that these recommended changes are being done specifically in response to Russian aggression. Right, Russian aggression is the term. I actually think this is kind of incorrect. I think this is probably to do with America withdrawing from Europe. I think this is all fallout from the instability that Donald Trump has brought about, where America is no longer a reliable ally.
Yeah.
So, battle readiness in 2025 means being able to fight, one, without the support of America, and two, in a new drone style trench warfare that we've been seeing in Ukraine, that is probably like trench warfare seems to be returning. Battle lines that just don't move seem to be the norm as they were in the early 20th century. It seems like they're becoming the norm again. So the need to invest in things like drone infrastructure is as important today as in the early 1900s. It was important to invest in either tank infrastructure or artillery infrastructure, because that is what you do a lot of your fighting with, mining up the battlefield, trench digging tools and that sort of thing. In the modern era, I guess you'd also want heat. I'm trying to think of the term. Thermal scopes, so that you can see people peering over the top of the trench and firing at you from a distance. All of these technologies are really important to the modern battlefield. But it's important to say that the only reason that we're doing all this investment right now is because of the situation that Donald Trump has put the Europe in, basically saying you're on your own. And certainly, even if he's not saying you're on your own, his actions show that he's not a stable ally. How did Donald Trump get elected? Well, Donald Trump got elected because liberals, being advised by Keir Starmer and his absolute disaster of a government who can't adapt their strategy, they think that just playing to the right wing is how you win elections. Because of their inability to actually adapt, because they were stuck with Joe Biden, stuck in place in the USA for so long. And then Kamala Harris was playing to the right. She was being with Liz Cheney. Liz Cheney. Sorry, Liz Cheney. She was spending time with Liz Cheney. It was all playing to the right. This is what battle readiness means in 2025. It's a result of it's a result of liberals like messing things up in a major way and letting conservatives and fascists get away with the worst stuff by just playing to that same base.
I completely agree with you. There are so many points that you made that I want to unpack slightly. But when it's true, when Starmer talks about making the army battle ready and investing in lethality and putting Britain back where it belongs, all of these quotes coming directly from him. He's obviously not just emulating Tory nationalism. This is someone who is kind of like borrowing the language of Trump era defense posturing, bigger guns, louder threats, and this manufactured strength to mask any sort of political weakness. And what we're seeing is a weakening in terms of the Labour Party. I think the Labour Party has been weakening in its own way, doing the things that it's doing, with the winter fuel payments, with the two-child benefit cap, like all of these things have been weakening the Labour Party as is. Trump literally said he wanted a military that was so strong and so powerful that it would make the enemies tremble. And I find that with the verbiage that Starmer is using, it kind of emulates that same thing. It's just it's a different accent, but kind of the same logic. This whole idea that well, if we can make ourselves 10 times more lethal, then it's just this I don't know, this politics of just spectacle. How can we posture that we are strong and we are a threat? Well, let's just buy more guns and make it seem as though we're strong enough. But what if this Labour Party was a party for Labour? I'd maybe see more defence happening for the people that actually exist in this country. I'm finding that the working people and the people who are most minoritised, the people who are most vulnerable, who literally exist in the margins of society, are suffering the most. And I see no one coming to their beck and call defending them. And that's the one thing that's really, really irritating me. He is not defending democracy in the slightest. I think he's mimicking strongman politics, which he actually went in pretending to oppose. But I do have another question for you on this. He does increasing lethality, lethal weapons or whatever, actually make us safer? Does it just entangle us in more conflict abroad?
I think that the closest that human beings have come to annihilating all life on the only planet that we've ever known that can sustain life was the Cuban Missile Crisis. How did the Cuban Missile Crisis come about? The Cuban Missile Crisis came about through a Mexican standoff, through everybody believing that the other side was just about to fire their guns, so they had to get ready to fire theirs. I think the Cuban Missile Crisis was stopped by a couple of staff members. Like human life nearly ended in the 1960s. And this sort of Mexican standoff style logic really does get us to the worst places. It's one of the reasons that I'm a big supporter of either nuclear disarmament, or if we can't get immediate nuclear disarmament, the idea of a virtual nuclear arsenal, which is an arsenal that's kept in parts. So Japan has a virtual nuclear arsenal. And I think South Africa has a virtual nuclear arsenal as well. The idea is that these countries can put together a nuclear weapon. They have all the bits, but they're kept separate. So it's not like finger on the trigger all the time, right? And I think that approach is what keeps us safer. Not it's having the technology, but not having it like readily available. And I think in a way that the UK already had like a conventional, a virtual conventional armory as it was. We know the UK is good at producing weapons. We have horrific companies that make horrific weapons that make horrific amounts of money for absolutely horrific people that then influence our politics in horrific ways. It doesn't make us safer, of course, but what it does do is distract from economic instability, which is why conflict so often in history follows economic instability, right? The economic instability in the late 1800s, the early 1890s was followed by World War One. And actually into the 1910s as well, there was a lot of economic instability. But also, of course, I'm thinking of the 1929 financial crash and the links between that and the Second World War. so often it's that nationalist leaders need distraction from economic instability. And so the rhetoric they turn to is one that isolates um, others abroad, right? The idea is you can either blame enemies from within or enemies from without, but you have to blame somebody because you need a reason as to why people are suffering. And you need somewhere for like the anger of the community at inequality and at economic instability. You need somewhere for that anger to go. So they either turn the rhetoric on internal groups. They either turn it on immigrants, as one of the classic examples, like LGBT people. It becomes about like purifying your society, and keeping your own identity. They're not like us, type thing. Um, or you can either do that, or you can say, well, China, Russia, these countries, they're creating big scary arsenals, so we need to have arsenals that are ready to. And I'm not saying that Russia and China aren't a threat, because I think there's legitimate threat from both Russia and China in different ways. But I do think that this language and the methods being used here are not about protecting us from Russia and China. We're living in an era where, and Britain already has access to nuclear warheads. I don't think people understand just how devastating nuclear weapons are. I had a field expert come and talk to us during my university days about nuclear weapons, and she was asked by an audience member. She was asked, like, what would you do if a nuclear weapon like actually went off? Is there any truth to this kind of duck and cover stuff? And she was like, if the UK was involved in a nuclear exchange, she said she would put on all of her black clothes and go outside and stand where she thought the center of the blast would be, because it was better to die really, really fast than to be in the fallout of what would come as a result. I don't think people understand how devastating nuclear weapons are. I just don't think we think about it. And another thing that we don't think about is the idea that a nuclear warhead often contains, it's a single rocket that contains lots and lots of nuclear bombs that then rain down across a whole geographical area and set off like multiple Nagasaki's, Hiroshima's, like going off all at once. This is like the devastation of nuclear weapons is already more lethal firepower than any country could ever need. The idea that having a more lethal military, the idea that being more lethal is the future of, is how we keep people safe. It's kind of a nonsense when we've already got access to those sorts of weapons. It really is quite
Yeah,
nonsense. Anybody who's
absolutely.
not deterred by that is not going to be deterred by you having extra drone technology. That's kind of not how it works. It's all about fueling companies, fueling profits that pay for that pay politicians, pay politicians in Reform, pay politicians in Labour, and pay politicians in the Conservative Party. One last thing. Sorry, I'm aware I'm rambling a little bit.
You're not rambling.
But we need to get an understanding that we are not an empire anymore. We are not a big guns, big trade empire anymore. The US still has a bit of that about them, but the US needs to come to the same realization, because the future of the West in general, we need to recognize that the future of the West in general is not hard power, it's soft power. The only hope of influence that we have in the future, literally the only hope, just because of the way that China and India in particular are outproducing us, and they are outproducing us by miles. They are going to outproduce America and outwealth America by miles by 2050. The only way to have any sort of advantage in the world that is being built is building soft power, and that means building influence, and that means that your reputation matters. That means all of this stuff that's going on with Israel, it's destroying our chances at a future where the West has influence. We are going to be, if we do not buck up and actually be more harsh on nationalist politicians who think that building bigger guns is the future of the West. If we're not more harsh on these people, and we're not going, no, you are being stupid, you need to be smart, you need to understand that it's going to be trade relations, and it's going to be media influence throughout the world, and the West's future of media influence, that is going to be what maintains the West's power. If we don't come to this understanding, the West is the West, but more particularly Britain, which is already doesn't have an empire, is going to be a power that is acted upon rather than act upon other nations. And based on the way that we've treated other nations, they're not going to be kind to us. Why would they be? We haven't been kind to them. We've been horrible to them. We need
Yeah.
to come to that understanding. Lethality is not the future.
Yeah.
Morality is the future.
Really well said. And you're absolutely right. Britain is not an empire anymore. Just, I think it's imperial cosplay for a nation that's in decline, and it's irritating because I think if this is, you explained it so well. I don't think I can explain it any more than that. But I do think this power projection. I do think it's theatre, and I think the longer that Starmer talks about rearming Britain, the more I get put off of him, and I was put off of him before, but I think this country will become more lethal in the way that it impacts working people and the oppressed people abroad. That is the lethality that I see happening at the moment and unfolding. I don't see us arming ourselves as the most lethal thing. I see people in suits doing what they're doing and impacting the poor at home. Right. Shall we go to our producer for comments?
Hello.
Hello.
It's the voice from God again with the voiceover.
Great to have you.
Dear me. And you, great show as always. Right, where should we start? Let me just have a look. I know exactly where we're going to start. We're going to start with our incredible, as always, community. Specs has gifted 5 Turn Left memberships. Thank you, Specs. So we've got Autumn, Tariq.
Thank you.
James Corden, not the James Corden, I'm sure. Oliver and Dazza. So thank you, Specs, for those.
Thank you.
Graham Turner with a $4.99. Turn Left, have you tried switching it off and on? That's my tech advice.
So that's what Callum did the same thing. So before we'd come on, he was like, Sarah, I don't mean to be pedantic, but have you tried turning it off and on? I was like, Callum, not now. I don't need this right now.
And had you tried turning it off and on?
I absolutely did. Yes,
sure?
I did. Yeah, I did.
Yeah, sound advice and sound advice as well, Graham. Thank you. And we've got 5 Turn Left memberships gifted as well by William, which again we're grateful for. So that's Faye,
thank you,
Shabazz, Comedy Jaw, Aaron, and Carmack as well, who've all received memberships from there. So thank you for gifting those. We do really appreciate it. On the tech issues, Andrew said, starting to think all these tech issues are just a ruse so we can fund the studio quicker. Honestly, Andrew, listen, we wouldn't be buying a studio straight away anyway. There's so much more that your support goes towards, like our ability to attend the Media Democracy Festival at the weekend, content from which you will start to see in the coming days on the channel.
That at the start. Sorry, we were busy this weekend.
We were very busy this weekend.
Yeah.
We had 2 live streams. For those of you that weren't able to watch live, those are up on the channel as well for anyone that wishes to watch them. There's some brilliant interviews on there, and there's some fantastic interviews coming soon as well. So keep your eyes peeled for that. But honestly, the ability for us to travel from 5 different parts of the country to get to London, to stay in London for the weekend so that we were able to attend and cover the event. None of that we would have been able to do without your support. So
we got interviews from so many amazing people this weekend.
Many amazing people.
From people like Dan Hind to Hardeep Matharu of Byline Times. Aaron Bastani, Navarro Media, had really interesting. He bought Curtis a drink. He was absolutely lovely. We were able to chat with him.
Wait, was that not Curtis? I thought that was Curtis I was speaking to. Was that Aaron?
That was Aaron.
I know,
very
but
similar.
Zach Polanski as well, and there's
Zach Polanski,
Lexi Connell-Kawana, the CEO of Impress. So really exciting thing.
Yes, and importantly, Sangeeta Maiska as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that one will be coming once it's edited for you. But that interview, well, all the interviews that we had, people were so generous with their time as well.
Yeah.
You know, the people are aware that obviously
The
we're a
volunteers.
voluntary organisation, but we've already said it, but just want to say again a huge thank you to the Media Reform Coalition for taking us on board as their official media partners for the event as well.
Yes.
You know, and we were able to carry out some incredible interviews, which you will see, and some of those are already live because we did them during the live stream. So feel free to go and watch those videos as well and catch up.
Yes.
But things like that, we want to do more of that. You know, the studio's great, and that's a long-term goal, but you know.
Yeah, I wanted to give a big thank you to Mike in particular, who was kind of one of the unsung heroes of that day. Mike was our runner. He was running and getting people for us as they finished their speeches, bringing us to the room, bringing them to the room that we had, and was just doing an amazing job. We felt like we had to get him some chocolate at the end, and we had to sort out some vegan chocolate because we weren't aware that it'd be he'd be vegan. But we did it, and and we just it wasn't enough really to thank Mike for everything he did for us.
Yeah,
He was
definitely shout out Mike.
fantastic.
I think really, shout out Mike.
But like I say, stay tuned for more content from that weekend.
We're gonna get bigger and better. Yay!
So I think I'm just gonna bring these in order. So Count Dracula, feed the poor and keep your war. This was sent quite early on. Actually, this was when we were talking about Sudan at the beginning. I know that, it's often said, but can we just all stop fighting, please?
I know. I wish, right? I wish.
It's very like that hits on pretty much all of the topics we've talked about tonight. Really, kind of. Yeah.
And the first story, it's true. Sudan is obviously collapsing right in front of us, and I think that this fire is obviously being fueled by those around it, by those that wanna I think you have to look at the flow of money and where the arms are coming from. You'd mentioned this, and we spoke about it briefly, but gold mined in Sudan's conflict zones, being whisked abroad in these foreign bank accounts, and nearly all of it kind of ends up in Dubai. So that I think there's so much that could be happening, and the great powers of diplomacy, where are they? Sudan's literally burning on Western capital. I think offers nothing but lofty promises.
Hi, Luna. Luna said Starmer is going to build up 12 submarines. What about the £22 billion black hole we keep hearing about? And that feeds into the previous comment. It's interesting, isn't it, that there's always money for war.
Always. Always feed the poor. Feed the poor. Feed the poor.
And Jacqueline on the same point. Funny how Starmer doesn't have any money to fill children, pay disabled people the money they deserve, and stop the elderly from freezing, but he can spend the money on military stuff. And again, this comment came in earlier on when we were talking about the Sudan situation, but obviously it feeds into the last story as well. Interestingly, which I noticed today that Lindsay Hoyle had once again given a right rollick into the government because Keir Starmer decided to announce the defence, the new defence strategy to a audience of journalists in Glasgow rather than to the House of Commons. Again, completely going behind, going against the standards of the House and ignoring the fact that new announcements should be able to, be scrutinised by our elected politicians before being announced everywhere else to the public. Something that this Labour government and many within it were very, very quick to call out the last government on when they were doing the same thing. Now they're in charge, it seems that they don't really care about it and they just want to get it out in press conferences instead. Much to my annoyance, but also to the annoyance of the speaker, who once again had to tell them off. Jim speak. Legitimate concerns.
This is fucking ridiculous. What it is that from where I'm standing, it just feels like Starmer wants to feed into Britain's imperial delusion. Let's just spend more money on this ridiculous stuff. But I don't want to be part of a fantasy that's seeped in colonial nostalgia. No, thank you.
Unfortunately, I think that leads to some of the scenes that we saw in the summer, doesn't it? This whole, leading it into the second story, this idea that we should be out on the streets waving our flag, and anyone who doesn't look remotely like they are quote unquote native to this country, even though none of us are native if we trace our ancestors back far enough, that they should somehow not be here and they're the problem. And this legitimate concerns thing, we hear it all the time. We hear it on issues around trans people. We hear it on issues around when there's acts of terror or when crimes are committed. We hear it about asylum seekers. It's always the same thing. Oh, we're not racist. We're not transphobic. We're not homophobic. We just have legitimate concerns.
Yeah, I find it funny how that kind of language is never used. Like when Just Stop Oil block a road, no one ever turns around to the right wing press who are like raging about it and going, "Oh, you could be blocking an ambulance." By the way, Just Stop Oil have a blue lights policy, which means that if an ambulance appears, they unblock the road and let the ambulance through, which slows it down no more than like a traffic jam, like a regular traffic jam would, or an accident would,
or like a major flood on the motorway caused by increased freak weather events like what we saw in London.
Yes, increased global warming, but like no one turns around and goes, "Yeah, I understand that you don't want an ambulance to be inconvenienced, but these people have legitimate concerns. These protesters have legitimate concerns." It's not used in that way. Like the phrase "legitimate concerns" is always about those with power having legitimate concerns, which is always like code for they're not. They feel like they're not allowed to say the thing that they want to say, but it's actually that the thing that they want to say is just very stupid. It's very ignorant. You don't need to, you don't need to like have, at least for the most part. I do think there are legitimate concerns surrounding, for example, the spread of immigration across the country and the concentration of wealth within certain communities. I think those are legitimate concerns. I think that birth replacement rates and the number of people we've got in this country is a legitimate concern. I don't think that blaming brown people for the crimes committed in Southport, just blaming non-white people as a whole, attacking non-white people as a whole. It's not a legitimate concern.
Yeah,
It doesn't
I
even
think
come close.
it doesn't at all. I think, sorry, Callum, didn't mean to cut you off. But my legitimate concern is this huge proliferation and rise in white supremacy. I think the way that white supremacy is forming the fabrics of British society at the moment and has done for God knows how long is, I think, a legitimate concern for us to have. Because if we're seeing these sorts of things unfold in the way that they're unfolding, then we will be seeing harm to vulnerable and minoritized communities happen more often and then be normalized. Again, we don't want to sanitize or make it a palatable thing to talk about. It's not a palatable, it shouldn't be made palatable. But yeah, completely agree.
Something that's interesting to me is the way in which, you both discussed the way in which the media had sort of reported on certain stories as well. But we saw this in true fashion after the events in Liverpool last week, where all the initial response on social media was what people would have previously said were legitimate concerns when they were speculating about the race, religion, ethnic background of the perpetrator. Once it transpired that the individual, very quickly the news came out because the police wanted to avoid a repeat of what we saw in the summer, and we're learning from what happened in Southport. When we know that because of reports that have been published more recently. But when it came out that it was in fact a white British man, all of a sudden those quote unquote legitimate concerns disappeared, and suddenly it was, oh well, I mean, the guy must have been frightened. He must have had people were battering his car and people were scaring him. This guy, we now know, served in the Marines. So if we've got Marines who are responding to periods of high stress by ramming their car into crowds full of innocent people, then we've got a serious problem with the type of people we've got protecting this country, haven't we? If that's how they're trained to respond. But I do find it interesting that the way in which the media are portraying the man from Liverpool who carried out that attack, despite the fact that he was on drugs, and the fact that it's it's clear what happened. Obviously, there will be full investigations and probably court cases down the line, but we didn't see the same thing after Southport. What we saw after Southport was, even before we knew the identity of the attacker, there was speculation which led to rioting. The police were forced in the Liverpool case to stop that by releasing, his race. But because they did that, the legitimate concerns, quote unquote, just went out the window. And people reacted differently to it, and the media reacted differently to it.
Something else that's worth pointing out: the whole distinction between Southport and the Liverpool attack is that the right wing did this thing where they went when the news was announced, that the Liverpool attacker was a white man. They were like, "Oh, you were quick to announce that, weren't you?" And have you guys seen that meme of the guy in the hot dog suit going, "We're all looking for the guy who's done this," right? It always makes me think of that meme, because it's like, no, you created the conditions where the media feel like they have to put out the identity of the attacker really quickly to stop you speculating about it.
Yeah.
Like you did this. Like, it's not, we're all looking for the guy who did this. Yeah, I know who did it. It's you. What? Like, yeah.
It's also I do think he's still framed in a very humanizing way. Paul Doyle, the one that drove his car through Liverpool the way that he did. I still feel like he's being humanized in the media, but when it comes to black and brown bodies in particular, I think that there is a very quick, let me just make sure I get their mugshot in there. Let me just make sure I can make them seem as animalistic as possible. And that is something that I think forms the what is that noise? The fabric.
It's me.
That's fine. It's fine. That's something I think that forms the fabrics of our media. He attempted murder, and they were like, and people were still trying to have these ridiculous conspiracies about. No, it wasn't him in the car. No, he was wearing a blue shirt. No, it definitely wasn't him. No, but he was black. No, he was brown. But if he was black or brown, his mugshot would have been put on the media quite quickly. Yeah. I do believe that is the case. Maybe I'm being a tinfoil hat wearer.
You make a good point about the disparity between the dehumanization of black and brown people versus the way in which white criminals are portrayed. However, I do think it's important that we don't dehumanize horrible people when they commit atrocious crimes. And the reason I say that, Sarah, the reason I say it's important that we don't dehumanize them is because this happened. I was watching something recently actually talking about Adolf Hitler and the way in which the way that he behaved during Nazi Germany and the way that he's been portrayed. And I think it was a story that somebody told about a teacher who talked about the way in which Hitler was spoken about and said it's really important that we don't call him a monster, because by dehumanizing him in that way, it makes it really easy to separate, it's only monsters that do things like that. Real normal human beings wouldn't do that. It's only someone that's other would do that. And actually, it makes it easy to forget that anybody can be a monster. Anybody can be that horrific person. The middle-aged man who's a family man and lives in a cul-de-sac is capable of ramming down 20, 30, 40 people in the middle of the street. The Welsh choir boy that grew up in a family home in Southport is capable of murdering 3 little girls.
I agree, but I also think that we can't be using humanizing language to make them seem somewhat bearable. The way they were picturing Paul Doyle as this father of 3 with this wonderful picture of him at this what looked like a child's play thing with a dinosaur behind him, I'm thinking, this is not the man. I mean, this is the man that did it. Absolutely. Someone who people probably trusted, someone that people probably absolutely adored, and he was friends with people, a brother, a husband, or whatever. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, he's also he's someone that attempted to murder quite a number of people, and not just that, traumatized those around him who witnessed him do such an atrocious act. Humans are evil beings. I absolutely agree with you, but surely don't try to paint him as some sort of
No, but I think there's a difference between acknowledging that human beings can be evil and dehumanizing
I
people,
think
because
I think
like when you mentioned about Sudan, and we see the same in Palestine, right? When you dehumanize somebody,
But I'm not
it,
talking about dehumanizing them, Callum. I'm saying that what is important is that we do not show some sort of sympathy. Like that, I think
no, I
that's where I'm
agree.
trying to
I
get
do
at.
agree with that.
And I do think that with Paul Doyle, there's been immense
Hmm.
amounts of sympathy thrown towards him. So much so that people were doing conspiracies around, like, oh, well, I don't think it was him in the car. Oh, no, he wasn't wearing that
because he's
shirt.
white.
He's a white man.
Yeah,
Like, call it
because he's
out for
white.
what it is. He's a
Yeah,
white
yeah,
man.
I 100%
And
agree.
Yeah.
so
I don't think you
somebody's
disagree, by the way. I don't think the two of you disagree on that point. I
no,
just
we
think you're just
don't.
making slightly different points, but thinking you were. Yeah. I don't think you disagree, because I don't think Callum wants Paul Doyle to have the family man shot either. I think that
No, absolutely
we
not.
want them both to have the mugshot, or
Yeah.
both to have the family photo. Actual Rudy Cabana and Paul Doyle should get the same treatment, even though one of them's black and one of them's white. But the reality is that people don't get the same treatment when they're from
Yeah.
minoritized communities, particularly ethnic minorities.
Yeah,
You know?
and they should, in in that sense. Like, although I mean, with Axel Rudy Cabana, a lot of people criticised the fact that he was described as a Welsh choir boy. And even though it was the mugshot that was published that made him look like a complete maniac, and they definitely haven't done. I mean, maybe we'll get a mugshot with Paul Doyle. We'll see. We certainly haven't got that yet. But I do think that. I think it's important, and I totally understand. I totally agree with what you're saying, Sarah. But I do also think it's important. And to caveat, I don't think that what the media are doing right now is what I'm saying we should do. I think what the media are doing is they are trying to paint him. They are trying to paint a picture that makes us question whether this was a deliberate act or whether this was just a horrible, horrible accident. Because surely a man of, a man in a middle class cul-de-sac who served for our country couldn't possibly do something so horrible. I think that's what they're trying to push, and I don't agree with that. But I do think it's important that we. That we acknowledge when people commit horrific acts like this, that we don't dehumanize them to the point where it almost excuses their
I
behavior.
agree. I agree.
Because as Undisputed King has said, men are naturally more violent, right? It's not that
No.
some men
That's a
are
lie.
these
Yeah.
monsters, or evil beings and spawns of the devil. Normal human beings can be horrific and do horrific things.
I actually highlighted that comment. I remember starring that comment because I wanted to use this as an example of the way that so often like actual genuine misandry, like not feminists are being mean to me, that's misandry, but actual like the attribution of negative characteristics to men based on some like biological essentialism, you're naturally more violent. It crops up in these conversations in the worst way. And it's not, by the way, it's not feminists doing this. It's typically, I don't know, I can't speak to Undisputed King, but it's typically anti-feminists, it's red pillars and people who hold those sorts of views and who tend to be more on the anti-immigrant wing of politics, who tend to do most of this stuff that are like, oh, men are just like naturally more violent. No, men are not naturally more violent. Men commit reams and reams of violence in our society, but that is because of how we educate men, that they always have to be in control, and the only method of control that they are allowed and the only expression that they're allowed is anger. They're only allowed anger and violence, and because strength is seen as like anger and violence, and that's how you maintain your position at the top of
Yeah.
the hierarchy. That's the situation we
Agreed.
end up in. It's not that
Agreed.
men are naturally more
And
violent.
and
And
I
Sorry.
completely. So go ahead, Callum.
well, I just want to say, because Jacqueline said, as long as you will be saying this if the perpetrator had been racialized as black or brown, Callum. And I think what I'm saying is that I it's quite a nuanced point I'm trying to make, and I don't think I'm making it particularly well. Cog might be able to help me out with it, but what I'm essentially saying is that we absolutely shouldn't be like, this whole cul-de-sac thing is nonsense. It is clearly the media trying to make us feel a particular way about Paul Doyle, right? That, like, there's no questions in my mind about that. But what I am saying is that it came out of the words that Sarah was using about humanization and dehumanization, is that calling somebody a monster or using language like that, which, to be fair, I don't think anyone here was using. It's just an example. It removes that humanity from the individual, and it makes people believe that normal human beings, everybody else isn't capable of that thing. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that human beings are because it gives people an excuse to do it. People refer to Netanyahu as a monster all the time, right? Actually, he's a horrible, horrific, violent human being who is capable of doing horrific things.
And not out of step, by the way, with a lot of Israeli society. But if they can sort of chuck it off on Netanyahu, then they sort of excuse themselves. So, like, it is a delicate point to make. I don't know how easy it is, though, to relate this to, like, media coverage of the way that particularly Axel Rudkabana and Paul Doyle have been covered, because I do think that
I think often we see, sorry to interrupt, but I think often we do see black and brown people and people of other minoritized groups being portrayed as those monsters, and in those sorts of terms. We hear we hear members of the LGBT community referred to as sexual predators, and other dehumanizing language about an entire group that we don't see when we see coverage of people like Paul Doyle. What I'm saying is that there should be consistency in the media when reporting on these cases. If you want to make the point that a perpetrator was a well-respected human being, then that's fine, but you need to do that across the board for everyone. But that can't be missing the context of what they've done, and it can't be used to try and lessen the crime that somebody's done, if that makes sense. I don't know whether I'm making this point well or not.
No, you're making sense. No, you are. I think because the fact of the matter is, it's humans that commit these acts. Humans are capable of violence. Institutions allow them to thrive. Yeah. So, but it's human beings that are doing these atrocious acts. And just going back to that point about men being naturally more violent, I think violence is something that is learned and can be unlearned. Men are not born violent; they're just socialized into systems that treat power and control and domination as some sort of currency. So I do think it's just the capitalist patriarchal system in the most simplest, most succinct way possible. And I think what we're seeing is that when people say, "Oh, men are just naturally violent," it shields them from accountability. So I think that's what we need to venture away from.
100%.
Right, just before we wrap up, we've got some questions, some comments just on the last story. Let me look at this one from Vicky. It would be nice, really, if Starmer decided to invest in massively improving / expanding the diplomatic services to try to form alliances and stave off any potential war through Georgia. I agree. We need to, it will be much better for the government to invest the time into sitting down, getting around the table with people, having conversations, trying to prevent war, than simply mustering up our defence. What do you guys think?
Yeah, it would be nice really if someone decided to invest in massive improvement. Yeah, I completely agree. This is exactly what I was saying earlier, to be honest. This whole, the people who suffer the most are the poorest and those who are oppressed abroad. And I think the longer we allow for Starmer to talk about rearming Britain and, he wants to defend democracy, all this sort of stuff, I think the less we're going to focus on the real issues that matter. He is a performative, flip-flopping idiot that doesn't represent the working people. It's irritating. So yeah, I completely agree with you, Vicky. I agree. I think Andrew sent in a super chat, actually.
Yes, he did. We've got it here. So it's remember how they cropped Mark Duggan's pic in his child's grave to make it scary for white people.
Facts.
Yeah.
A really great point. And Andrew, thanks for the donation, but such a good point. Again, what the media does when it comes to obviously racialized individuals, black and minoritized individuals, black and brown bodies, is literally put them in a category where they are simply just that black and brown body. They will demonize black and brown bodies in any opportunity they get. And we see it all the bloody time. And I do think that if we do not start calling it out when it happens, again, it's going to just proliferate in the same way it does. And it happens a lot. Whenever I've seen the word thugs be used before the Southport riots happened, was actually towards black and brown communities. All the time I'd seen politicians really say that thug behavior, and it was always towards people who were black and brown. Like, why is that? It's because they demonize black and brown bodies.
It's today's the 15th anniversary of the West Cumbria shootings, where in the town that I grew up in, when a white man went on a rampage and took the lives of 12 people, one of whom was his own brother. And I remember when that happened, the way in which that was reported, again, because he was white, it was all, oh, he must have been struggling with his mental health. It must have been, there was never any question, could it be terrorism? Never any question, none of the sort of the language that we see when the perpetrator isn't white. And I mean, that was 15 years ago. And things haven't changed at all, have they? They're still exactly the same today. Okay, let me there was just two more, I think, that I wanted to bring up. So Justin said, NATO is not about defence. We really don't care about Ukraine either. The UK has always had a wall-to-wall consensus of warmongering, and it'll be like that until we detach from America. Thoughts?
I don't entirely agree. I think that there are elements within NATO that are genuinely about defence. I'm not a big NATO fan generally, because I think that it is continuing a tradition of imperialism. Don't get me wrong, but I think there are degrees to which NATO is being used defensively. For example, if you're Poland, or you're one of the Baltic states, one of the other Baltic states, you are depending on NATO in a defensive way. It's America. America does use NATO in an imperialistic way, but America uses everything from the World Trade Organization to the UN in an imperialistic fashion. Even UN peacekeepers, which are mostly Americans, their influence over the UN peacekeepers means that they use the UN in an imperialistic way. I don't entirely dismiss NATO as a defensive a defensive force, but I'd say it is heavily dependent upon the context. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, that's my kind of thoughts on it.
Yeah, well said.
And I just before we go, just on it's actually on the previous point, but Williams just made an interesting comment. So it's in 2 bits. So reminds me of when the Asian chap took a crossbow to Windsor Castle. I can't remember what was up with him, bipolar maybe, but automatic terrorist. And I'm like, he went there, made his point, handed himself in, and has begged for help, and you make him out to be something other than human insanity. And it just highlights the disparity, doesn't it? Again, when it's if the perpetrator in that instance had been a white man, the press and the media would have covered it and probably been happy to help and have said, the poor guy, he was clearly struggling, he needed the help, but because he was Asian, he must just be a terrorist. We see that both ways. There's loads more comments that we could go through, but we'll be here all day if we do that. So.
And it's getting quite late.
Yeah, so hand back to you guys.
Thank you so much, Callum. You're amazing, as usual. And thank you, Cog. Honestly, it's been really good. But I think what we see here is we, even at Turn Left, we tend to sometimes get quite heated in our discussions, but it comes from a place of absolute love and admiration. It's okay. I just heard Callum in the back, but it really does, because sometimes we don't actually fully see eye to eye on certain things. But I think the fundamental when it comes to all of these discourses is that it happens in a space that is safe, and it needs to happen. I think we have to accept some sort of challenge every now and then, and it's a wonderful thing when it does. But thank you so much to Cog, and thank you to all of you. You guys are all so fantastic and amazing and so supportive. I'm really, really grateful for each and every one of you. So remember to like the stream. And if you're not a subscriber, then please hit that button. I'll get comfortable saying that at some point. And if you want to see us grow or get new tech so that me and Lewis aren't always late, you can head over to turnleftmedia.co.uk/support. And there is a link to our Patreon where you can support us monthly or follow the other link to give us a one-time contribution. But please don't put yourself out. You guys are so wonderful and amazing. And I think just your presence is more than priceless. Alternatively, you can just become a member for 99 pence. But thank you so much for watching. I am Sarah, and I'll probably see you Friday with Curtis.
Support independent media, support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you. Turn left.